The AMD RX 560 launches today with 2GB versions priced at around $100 and 4GB versions around $115. We're reviewing the Sapphire RX 560 Pulse OC today, a 4GB variant at $115. The GTX 1050 is the most immediate competition and previously outranked the RX 460 in the majority of our tests with similar pricing. The RX 560 returns in an attempt to change that hierarchy, continuing AMD's line of Polaris refresh cards, flanked by the 1050 and 1050 Ti, with the RX 570 at the higher end. Before that, this content is brought to you by custom backplate makers v1tech.com. V1Tech builds GPU backplates to order with their online customization tool, making it easy to theme upcoming PC builds. Backplates cost $25 and up and are installed via magnet, and can be seen in some shots of the cards we're reviewing lately. Use code GAMERSNEXUS5 for $5 off your order, or click the link below. This review will be pretty quick and easy by our standards anyway. The 560 isn't anything crazy new. It's still Polaris architecture, just like the 580 was. It's a refresh of an existing line of AMD architecture from last year. And with the 560, the main change here, rather than just going with frequency and voltage changes like we saw with the 580 over the 480 or 570 over the 470, what we have here is a fully unlocked 560. So the 460 previously had some locked cores. It had 2 CUs that were unavailable to the user. So it was 14 rather than the full 16 on the chip. This one goes for the full 16 CUs, which means you're not only getting a frequency difference depending on which card you buy or look at, but also getting a core count difference. So the differences here in performance are more than just frequency changes, basically. We do have some core changes as well. As for this particular card, the Pulse OC is a $115 model, which makes it one of the sort of borderline limit cards where you start bumping into territory where other cards might make more sense. And the lower end 2GB models are around $100, directly competing with the GTX 1050, where previously the RX 460 was competing. This model is pretty straightforward. About half of the PCB doesn't even really, well, about a third of the PCB doesn't even really need to be there. It's just basically blank. And what you end up with is a very tiny GPU die. It's one of the smallest that AMD is shipping right now, with a couple of VRAM modules and a 3-phase VRM. For the VRM, and we, as you can see by the thermocouples, did test thermals on the VRM and the VRAM. The VRM is using magnet chip semiconductor FETs, so they're using MDU 1514 and MDU 1517 FETs. They're not amazing. It's a 3-phase, it's pretty basic, but this isn't really an overclocking card anyway. So pretty basic card, very cheap, and it's just targeting ultra budget builds. And we're going to test it today versus the GTX 1050 primarily, 1050 Ti, look at the previous RX 460, and a couple of our tests have a bit of everything in there so you can see the full stack up as this compares to things like a 470, 570, and up. For full testing methodology, as always, check the link in the description below. That's the complete review, written review. We've got 3D Mark tests in there that we won't have here, but otherwise most of the stuff will be here. In addition to the normal testing methodology, one quick note, some of these cards, somewhat annoyingly, have OC in their name, which means that in the charts, when we list OC, it means either it's actually overclocked by us or the card is named OC. An example would be the MSI GTX 1050 OC card, which is not really overclocked. It's one of the cheapest 1050s that is out there. We're testing it because it's cheap. It's $100. Normally $80 after rebates right now. MSI just tags the letters OC on it. So we're going to put quotes around OC if it's part of the card name as opposed to actually overclocked. Just a quick note. Starting off with total power consumption as measured at the wall, our RX 560 Pulse configuration draws 67 watts when idle, with the overclocked variant mostly equal to this. This is a lower power consumption than the RX 460 for 2 reasons. 1, AMD tuned the 500 series of Polaris cards to draw lower power when idle. This is really just a BIOS update. And 2, the RX 460, we tested anyway, has LEDs and extra hardware on the board, like another fan, which increases power draw. For comparison, our MSI GTX 1050 model, which MSI calls the OC unit, but we're running stock, has equal power consumption in our tests to the RX 560 Pulse. Moving to 3D Mark Firestrike, the RX 560 Pulse faces a total system power draw of 148 watts, lower than the RX 460 Nitro, only because the 460 hosts 2 fans, LEDs, and different volt frequency curves. Otherwise, as we saw in our RX 580 versus RX 480 results, which we can highlight here, the 500 series has generally been drawing more power given the same PCB and cooler. This one is a bit different though. Regardless, 148 watts for the Pulse 4GB card, jumping to 172 when overclocked. The GTX 1050 configuration draws 139 watts with the MSI card, and the 1060 SSC, for reference, sits at around 219 watts total system power draw. In real-world gaming workloads, starting with For Honor, the RX 560 Pulse runs a power consumption of around 172 watts total system power draw. The RX 460 Nitro is at around 180 watts, and both fans are cranking in this case. The 560 Pulse overclocked card hovers around 193 watts total draw, below the GTX 1060 SSC at 218 watts total system power draw. The MSI 1050 card hovers at 153 watts total system power draw, marking it about 11% reduction in power consumption from the Pulse 560. Playing Ghost Recon Wildlands, we observe a total system power consumption of around 173 watts for the RX 560 Pulse. That's a reduction of about 5.7% from the particular RX 460 that we tested, with the overclocked Pulse build drawing 194 watts. This is about an 8% reduction from the GTX 1060 SSC. At the low end, the 1050 MSI card runs at 152 watts total system power draw. Moving now to thermal testing, we start with a simple frequency versus time chart to plot GPU core stability under a power virus scenario. Clocks are enumerated differently in these torture workloads than in gaming workloads, meaning the clock is lower than in gaming, but power consumption and thermals are higher. Given the low power cooler on the Sapphire 560 Pulse, we expected worse cooling performance than what was output in our torture workload. It seems that, thanks to the relatively low power consumption of the GPU compared to its larger counterparts, things are kept under control relatively, even with a heatsink that is similar to an Intel stock cooler. We're looking at an average GPU diode reading of approximately 75 Celsius, with the target seeming to be about 73 to 75 C. GPU clock maintains just below 1200 MHz, and we see some clock dithering at this point. Ideally, you'd observe a perfectly straight line for the clock, but our range is still about 20 MHz, which really isn't bad. To maintain this clock and temperature, the fan ramps up maximally to around 36% fan speed for 1600 RPM on this particular cooler. The next question is how the VRM and VRAM components hold up to the small cooler. Fortunately, because this card isn't driving much power, the VRMs actually do okay. With our thermocouple testing, we measured one of the hottest MOSFETs at around 63 Celsius, which is well within any reasonable operating temperature, and we're so far below the 125C threshold that FET temperatures are completely a non-issue here, at least for the stock card. The top left VRAM module is one of the hottest VRAM modules on the card and measures about 75 Celsius. We're still well within spec here, though it'd get a bit warm in a higher ambient environment with restrictive airflow. GPU diode temperature remains steady at around 73 to 75 Celsius, and we'll move on to gaming next, but for 3D Mark results, check the article linked in the description below. Starting our game testing with For Honor, the Sapphire RX 560 Pulse OC operates at 43 FPS average with this in-game test course. With GNs coined 1% low frame rate and 0.1% lows, we see 32.7 FPS and 28.7 FPS. This positions the RX 560 Pulse below the GTX 1050 from MSI, which despite its name is not actually overclocked, and above the RX 460 4GB card. We've got a lead of about 5.7% over the previous RX 460 4GB card, running with the slower clock rate and fewer cores, and the GTX 1050 produces an 11.6% lead over the RX 560 Pulse OC. To compare versus other nearby cards, the $140 MSI GTX 1050 Ti runs at 57 FPS average, 49 FPS 1% lows, and 47 FPS 0.1% lows. This places the 1050 Ti approximately 19% ahead of the $100 GTX 1050 and 33% ahead of the RX 560. The RX 570 at $180 runs 35% faster than the GTX 1050 Ti. While those cards aren't the focus of today, they help us understand if and when the extra money could be worthwhile. Frame time consistency isn't king for the RX 560 in this particular title, as we can show on the frame time plot on the screen now, although the GTX 1050 does reasonably well when compared to the 560. Moving on to Mass Effect Andromeda, we start with higher settings tests to get some comparative numbers for the higher end cards, and then we'll move on to tests with medium settings. The $115 Sapphire RX 560 Pulse runs an average FPS of 37 with lows at 31 and 30, trailed by the RX 460 Nitro 4GB card, which runs a 34 FPS average. The 560 leads by about 8.8% over the 460. The next card up, the MSI 1050 $100 card, operates an average of 46 FPS, with lows tightly timed as on the previous cards. The 1050 Ti runs a 51 FPS average, outmatched quickly by an RX 570 at 63 FPS average. Let's look at the medium results. Although more limited, as we've only just begun testing lower-end GPUs, we get a better idea as to relative performance on these cards. With these settings, the GTX 1050 is able to hit 61 FPS average, with the RX 560 stock running 53 average, 45 FPS 1% lows, and 42 0.1% lows. This lands at about 6.6% better than the RX 460 Nitro 4GB card, with the overclocked 560 Pulse running at 8.8% faster than the stock RX 560. Moving now to Doom with Vulkan and async compute, the RX 560 finally begins to pull ahead of the GTX 1050. In fact, once overclocked, it also pulls ahead of the more expensive 1050 Ti. This is in line with what we've seen out of this particular game in the past, where Doom tends to produce more favorable results for AMD with its Vulkan integration. The MSI 1050 OC struggles a bit, maintaining an average FPS of 44 with lows dipping to 25, and overall produces less consistent frame times than the RX 560 4GB card. The 560 averages 66 FPS, which is about 6.5% faster than the RX 460 4GB Nitro card. Overclocked, the 560 moves up to 74 FPS average, which is a 13% increase over its stock performance. For reference, the RX 570 4GB card averages at around 120 FPS or 60% faster than the RX 560 Pulse card. A quick note here, this is with Doom configured to ultra graphics at 1080p, not bad performance for these low-end devices, even the 1050, although we wouldn't really recommend it for this game. We now move to Ghost Recon Wildlands, where we've got tests at very high for comparison and then medium for more realistic representations of the cards. We've got a fairly complete view of performance from top to bottom with this chart with regard to scaling. The RX 560 Pulse operates an average FPS of 33.3, followed by the RX 460 4GB card at 32 FPS average. The GTX 1050 is able to sustain a higher average FPS at 36, with the 1050 Ti running about 42 average. For perspective, the RX 570 runs an average FPS of 51, leading the RX 560 by 53%. It's not until the RX 570, 580, and GTX 1060 territory that we start reaching numbers where it'd be possible to play on a mix of very high and high settings. The GTX 1060 is the real victor of that stack, but at more than 2 times the cost of the 1050 or the 560, it can't really be considered as an alternative in the price point. Instead of trying to make that work, let's run the test with lower settings, moving down to 1080p medium. Here's medium, where you'd more reasonably be playing on these $100 class cards. We've got fewer cards on this chart, but enough to start building an understanding of performance. The RX 560 Pulse now runs an average of 43 FPS, about 10 FPS higher than previously, landing at around 7.5% faster than the RX 460 4GB Nitro card. Overclocking gets us to 46 FPS average, which is about on par with the MSI 1050 card stock performance. The MSI GTX 1050 stock card operates 8.6% faster than the RX 560 4GB card. For reference, the GTX 1050 Ti stock card runs a 53 FPS average, making it 12.8% faster than the 1050 and 15.3% faster than the RX 560. The RX 570 is about 50% faster than the RX 560 for reference. And finally, we've got Sniper Elite 4, which is another game where we've only just started running low-end card tests, so it's not as populated as our 4K test charts. Looking at 1080p high, the RX 560 4GB card runs an average of 52 FPS, with overclocking producing a 9% performance improvement over baseline. The RX 460 runs a 49 FPS average, making the gap between the 460 and 560 about 6.7%. The GTX 1050 is led by all of these thanks to its 43 FPS average, though overclocking nearly gets its averages on par with the 460 despite lower performance and frame time consistency overall, as illustrated by GN's low values. These performance numbers plot the 560 close to the 1050 Ti, with the RX 570 hitting 100 FPS averages at times, just for reference. So it looks better than the RX 460 did at launch. With the 460, especially the 4GB pricing for the units that we received initially, it was hard to justify the purchase versus the 1050 because the 1050 was really just either performing equally or better in really all cases that we tested at the time. And it was about a $10 price difference at worst when the 1050 was $110. Now it's cheaper, it's $100. Sometimes you get them with 80 if you consider a rebate as part of the price. But these cards, the 2GB models, are at $100. We're planning to do a 2v4 test. 4GB, bit more. This one is 115 from what we've been told, so it's really not too bad. In the testing here today, the 560 makes up some ground where the 460 was losing. Finally, the RX 560 is competitive with the GTX 1050 in about half the titles we tested, and by competitive, it's either ahead or tied, and in the other half, it's a bit behind the 1050 still. But when the 560 is ahead, it's ahead by a good deal. So that's the real difference here. With Doom and Sniper Elite 4 being the main titles here, the seminal examples of low-level APIs being done correctly, the RX 560 takes the lead. With the DX11 titles we tested, the GTX 1050 takes the lead, or is pretty close to it anyway. So what you need to do for these cards is look at the type of games you're playing, figure out what API they're on apparently, and from there, you should be able to figure out which one's worth the buy. More realistically, what you do is you look at the price and you see if there's more than a $15 difference between them, at which point it's time to just pick based on price for the most part, because they're not hugely different in performance. Once you get above $120 for any of these cards, 1050, 560, or whatever, they start quickly losing value. The 1050 Ti is still in that really weird position it was when we first reviewed it, where it's an okay performer, but it sits between really strong performers at the low end, which would now be the 560 and the 1050, and pretty good performers at the mid-range, which would be the RX 470 or now the 570, with, of course, 1060s and 40s after that. So the 1050 Ti is still in a weird spot. It's worth buying for those really specific use cases where you have $140 and you can't possibly budget an extra 20 to 30 for a better card, like the 570 at this point. Or you have $10 more than you can spend on something like a 560 or a 1050. That's the only time the 1050 Ti makes sense. It's always been a weirdly positioned card. As for the low end though, 1050 still does really well. It is getting older at this point by standards in the GPU market, so that means it's harder to recommend. The 560 does just fine. It's not terrible, it's not impressive, it's just fine. So these are not the most exciting cards to look for reviews for, but if you are buying them, hopefully this helps you make a decision. We've got the numbers for you. You can check the article below for more of those numbers if this was not enough. As always, at patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly, you can go to store.gamersnexus.net to grab one of our shirts like this one. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more. I'll see you all next time.